allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
Hello, podcast listeners. This is Mac Payne here with episode 2916 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast, where we bring you news about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, I will continue my program of paying tribute to Vietnam War heroes who received the Congressional Medal of Honor for their service in that war. I do this to help make sure the names and deeds of these brave individuals are never forgotten as long as there is a USA. We must remember these brave individuals because they do so much to make and keep America great. It also builds up your patriotism when you hear these stories. That's another reason I share these stories with you, to build up patriotism in this country. Another tremendous reason for sharing these stories with you is to prove a point often made on this podcast. The Vietnam veteran generation is as great as any that ever heeded the call of duty from our country. These stories prove that point. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about Charles Kettles. He survived the Vietnam War and lived on to the ripe old age of 89. He recently passed away on January 21st, 2019. His story is very interesting to this Vietnam veteran. Number one, he was a fellow aviator. He flew Hueys in Vietnam, probably one of the most dangerous jobs there. Thank the good Lord above, I had one of the safest jobs. I was a Cobra gunship pilot with an ARA unit up at the 101st Airborne Division. It was safer because we carried heavy armaments, lots of those 2.75-inch folding fin aerial rockets. Huey pilots did not have much defensive firepower with them other than two M60s, and they had to fly into LZs and deliver troops, pick up troops and supplies. That was extremely dangerous compared to what we were doing flying the Cobra gunships. We brought down hellfire and destruction on the bad guys. Our aircraft are only about 3 feet wide. I don't think those guys firing those 50 calibers at us had real good eyesight because they really couldn't hit the Cobras the way we were flying them. We would come down from high levels in the sky and deliver on them hellfire and devastation with those rockets. In many cases, they would not even know we were there. I developed a technique of firing rockets accurately from thousands of feet up. Enough about us. I want to tell you about Charles Kettles, who retired as a lieutenant colonel. He had an incredible story. Something else that drew me to his story is that the heroics he displayed back in May of 1967 occurred near Duc Pho. I spent a few months there at the Duc Pho LZ, and it was an interesting area. It was also crawling within VA and VC. That's the scene that Charles Kettles entered that day that resulted in the eventual award of the Congressional Medal of Honor to him for what he did, which, when you hear the story, you'll agree with me, it's an incredible story. It's hard to believe he lived through that day, but he did, and he continued serving his country for many years. They wrote a story about him that appeared on the U.S. Army website. It is so good, I'm going to share that story with you. It lays it all out about his background and what he did at Duc Pho that day many years ago, far, far away in Vietnam. I suggest you pay tribute to his memory by listening carefully to his story. The best way to do that is to get rid of all the noisemakers in your immediate vicinity. Find the most comfortable chair in the room. Sit yourself down in that chair. Remove your headgear. And listen carefully to the story of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Kettles. With that in mind, let's get to it. Dateline, Washington, D.C. Retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel Charles S. Kettles was born in Ypsilanti, Michigan, January the 9th, 1930, the son of a World War I Royal Air Force, Canadian, and World War II Air Transport Command, U.S. Army Air Corps pilot. Kettles had aviation in his blood. While attending the Edison Institute High School in Dearborn, Michigan, Kettles honed his love of flying on the Ford Motor Company Flight Department simulator. Following high school graduation, Kettles enrolled in Michigan State Normal College, now Eastern Michigan University, where he studied engineering. 2 years later, Kettles was drafted into the Army at the age of 21. Upon completion of basic training at Camp Breckenridge, Kentucky, Kettles attended Officer Candidate School at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and earned his commission as an armor officer in the U.S. Army Reserve on February 28, 1953. Kettles graduated from the Army Aviation School in 1953 before serving active duty tours in Korea, Japan, and Thailand. Kettles returned in 1956 and established a Ford dealership in DeWitt, Michigan with his brother, and continued his service with the Army Reserve as a member of the 4th Battalion, 20th Field Artillery. He answered the call to serve again in 1963 when the United States was engaged in the Vietnam War and needed pilots. Fixed-wing qualified, Kettles volunteered for active duty. He attended helicopter transition training at Fort Walters, Texas, one of my favorite places, in 1964. During a tour in France the following year, Kettles was cross-trained to fly the famed UH-1 Huey. Kettles reported to Fort Benning, Georgia in 1966 to join a new helicopter unit. He was assigned as a flight commander with the 176th Assault Helicopter Company, 14th Combat Aviation Battalion, and deployed to Vietnam from February through November of 1967. His second tour of duty in Vietnam lasted from October 69 through October of 70. In 1970, Kettles went to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, where he served as an aviation team chief and readiness coordinator supporting the Army Reserve. He remained in San Antonio until his retirement from the Army in 1978. Kettles completed his bachelor's degree at Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio, Texas, and earned his master's degree at Eastern Michigan University College of Technology in commercial construction. He went on to develop the aviation management program at the College of Technology and taught both disciplines. He later worked for Chrysler Pentaster Aviation until his retirement in 1993. Kettles moved to Ypsilanti, Michigan, where he lived with his wife, Ann. Kettles' awards and decorations include the Distinguished Service Cross, the Legion of Merit, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Bronze Star Medal with 1 bronze oak leaf cluster, Air Medal with numeral 27, the Army Commendation Medal, and 1 bronze oak leaf cluster, and others. Let's talk about the battle now. It was May the 15th, 1968 at Duck Pho, along the Song Tre Chau riverbed. During the early morning hours of May the 15th, 1967, personnel from the 1st Brigade, 101st Airborne Division were ambushed in the Song Tre Chau riverbed by an estimated battalion-sized force of NVA, with numerous automatic weapons, machine guns, mortars, and recoilless rifles. The enemy force fired from a fortified complex of deeply embedded tunnels and bunkers and was shielded from suppressive fire. Upon learning that the 1st Brigade had suffered casualties during an intense firefight with the enemy, then Major Charles S. Kettles volunteered to lead a flight of 6 Hueys to carry reinforcements to the embattled forces and to evacuate wounded personnel. As the flight approached the landing zone, it came under heavy enemy attack. Deadly fire was received from multiple directions, and soldiers were hit and killed before they could leave the arriving lift helicopters. Jets dropped napalm and bombs on the enemy machine guns on the ridges overlooking the landing zone with minimal effect. Small arms and automatic weapons fire continued to rake the landing zone, inflicting heavy damage to the helicopters. However, Kettles refused to depart until all reinforcements and supplies were offloaded and wounded personnel were loaded on the helicopters to capacity. Kettles led them out of the battle area and back to the staging area to pick up additional reinforcements. Kettles then returned to the battlefield with full knowledge of the intense enemy fire awaiting his arrival. Bringing reinforcements, he landed in the midst of enemy mortar and automatic weapons fire that seriously wounded his gunner and severely damaged his aircraft. Upon departing, Kettles was advised by another helicopter crew that he had fuel streaming out of his aircraft. Despite the risk posed by the leaking fuel, he nursed the damaged aircraft back to base. Later that day, the infantry battalion commander requested immediate emergency extraction of the remaining 40 troops and 4 members of Kettles' unit who were stranded when their helicopter was destroyed by enemy fire. With only one flyable Huey remaining, Kettles volunteered to return to the deadly landing zone for a third time, leading a flight of 6 evacuation helicopters, 5 of which were from the 161st Aviation Company. During the extraction, Kettles was informed by the last helicopter that all personnel were on board and departed the landing zone accordingly. Army gunships supporting the evacuation also departed the area. Once airborne, Kettles was advised that 8 troops had been unable to reach the evacuation helicopters due to the intense enemy fire. With complete disregard for his own safety, Kettles passed the lead to another helicopter and returned to the landing zone to rescue the remaining troops. Without gunship, artillery, or tactical aircraft support, the enemy concentrated all firepower on his lone aircraft, which was immediately damaged by a mortar round that damaged the tail boom, the main rotor blade, shattered both front windshields and the chin bubble, and was further raked by small arms and machine gun fire. Now, you would think he was done for. His aircraft was damaged so much you would not think it would be able to fly. But hold on. Despite the intense enemy fire, Kettles maintained control of the aircraft and situation, allowing time for the remaining 8 soldiers to board the aircraft. In spite of the severe damage to his helicopter, Kettles once more skillfully guided his heavily damaged aircraft to safety. Without his courageous actions and superior flying skills, the last group of soldiers and his crew would never have made it off the battlefield. There you have the story of an incredible Vietnam War hero, Charles Kettles, who did some incredible flying over there near Duck Pho back in 1967. America is extremely fortunate to have people like Charles Kettles who are willing to serve in the military during wartime and when the time comes to do something extremely heroic. On behalf of a grateful nation, I hereby issue Lieutenant Colonel Charles Kettles an official Vietnam Veteran News Podcast salute for his service to his country. Charles Kettles, you were and still are a great one. Rest in peace, sir. That is my opinion, and I am sticking to it. This is Mac Payne here, closing out episode 2916 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News. Thank you again for listening.